This episode is presented by Invest Puerto Rico. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. I'm Rebecca Balan, and this is the episode where we bring on industry experts to help us home in on a trend in the tech world and dive deep. Over here at Equity, we've noticed a growing interest in two sectors in particular, space and solar. One startup hopes to combine the two by leveraging the tailwinds of both the commercial space industry and the world's need for renewable energy. So today we're going to talk to Baiju Bhatt. He's the former co-founder at retail stock trading app Robinhood, but more recently he's launched a new startup called Aetherflux, and that's dedicated to space-based solar power. Baiju, welcome to the show.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. So for those who don't know, Baiju is the co-founder of Robinhood, a very popular stock trading app, and now the founder of Aetherflux. So what a shift. Can you tell me what inspired you to go from Robinhood, which is like fintech, to what your current company is, which is space-based energy?
Absolutely. I mean, the journey to space, perhaps, I think it started actually pretty early in my life. My family had this interesting trajectory where my dad, grown up in India, had wanted to study physics his whole life, been applying to PhD programs to get into graduate school to study physics in America, because that was kind of the dream, from a little town in India, which I guess now is not such a little town. He gets into a PhD program at the University of Huntsville, Alabama, right before I was born. And I grew up with him studying physics there, and then later on would go on to work at the NASA side of Langley Air Force Base, so NASA Langley. So I'd kind of grown up around the space industry. And I think with all little kids I get to kind of see the space industry, I kind of had this question about did the space industry happen before I was born, right? Because there weren't any moon landings happening or sort of like these amazing things that happened in the 60s when I was growing up. I kind of told myself, I ended up going to study physics as an undergrad at Stanford, which is where I'd go on to meet Vlad and start Robinhood. But I had this passion that if commercial space was going to become a thing again in my life, it was something that I wanted to be a part of. So life took me towards physics first, then starting Robinhood. And somehow I find myself wanting to work on space now. So
yeah, really cool. So your plan is to launch, a constellation of satellites that are designed to collect solar power in low Earth orbit and then beam it to Earth using infrared lasers. Do I have that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting.
And so it's an old NASA Department of Energy idea from the 1970s of space solar power, which actually originally was, I think, first sort of coined in an old Isaac Asimov short story as a part of those publications called Astounding Science Fiction from the 1930s and 40s. But the idea was basically, can you collect solar power in orbit? And doing so actually has some benefits over collecting it on the ground. Benefits being that depending on which orbit you're in, you can stay in the sort of direct sunlight for nearly continuous amounts of time. And also when you're in the sun, you get direct exposure to the sun. So you're outside of the atmosphere when you're collecting solar power. The benefits of having solar power in orbit, as I think was originally conceived by NASA back then, was that you'd be able to provide power on a nearly continuous basis to a ground location with solar power, which we obviously know when the sun sets, there's no solar power with terrestrial solar. So it's a cool idea from the 1970s. It doesn't exist. This is not a real part of society today. And so the starting point for this was, what's a direct path towards making base solar power a reality today? So our approach, it's not the old approach to space solar power. It's predicated on technology advancements that have happened in the ensuing 30, 40, 50 years. And using available components that you can either buy commercially or with a little bit of modification and saying, can we do a first demonstration of this capability? So our approach is large constellation of satellites, which each individually collect power, beam that power down to ground stations. And the idea is the more satellites we have in orbit, the more capacity we're adding to an energy grid in orbit. So we kind of have this bold dream of building a great American energy company and a great American energy grid in orbit for the next generation. So big, lofty ambitions.
Yeah, pretty huge, lofty ambitions. And I low-key wonder how many inventions came out of Asimov's, science fiction mind. And specifically for this one, so as you had said, solar from space delivered to Earth. It's not impacted by the weather. You can position satellites to capture more light, less land utilization, but it is, well, it's going to space. It's very expensive. It's time consuming. It's a lot. So how are you, I mean, you mentioned kind of using off the shelf parts, like how essential is something like that to scaling that, or even getting to a point where you can test it, right? Because you haven't tested it yet.
We started doing some testing in the lab. We're pretty early on in that process, but it's kicking off. Our big test for demonstrating this capability from orbit is targeted for next year.
Wow. When did you found the company again? Because that seems like a tight turnaround.
We're trying to do it very quickly. I started working on this full time when I left Robinhood, beginning early of last year. And the goal from the beginning was, how do we make this happen? Like in a relatively short amount of time? How do we demonstrate this capability? Because once we do a first demonstration, then we're going to know all the things that we need to make better, and we can start improving on it and really start figuring out what the path is towards making this technology much more available. But it starts with actually doing it. And so our approach has been, what is a direct path towards getting a first satellite in space that can do this? Mm-hmm. To do that, we didn't want to invent any new technology here. We wanted to use technology components that are already ready to go. Because if we wanted to get in the middle of trying to invent something new, that's not necessarily going to be possible in the time frame that we're talking about.
Yeah. I noticed that you have some people from Anduril working on your team, and Anduril is also, a defense tech company that also uses kind of like off-the-shelf parts to build its drones and stuff. So have you been kind of staffing out with people who have firsthand knowledge of how to do exactly that, pioneer tech using kind of standard parts?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a way of trying to do what we're doing where you can use very custom esoteric components, and you could probably spend multiples of what we think we can do it for and have it take like 5 times or 10 times as long. I think you're exactly right. And the reason why this is so interesting is that there are companies like SpaceX and Anduril, and I'd probably put companies like Tesla in there as well, that have taken the sort of like industrial manufacturing of advanced technology and basically asked the question, why can't we just use, like, for example, consumer grade electronics to do these things? Like, why do we have to have each component be so esoteric and so much more expensive than the versions that we use, for example, on our iPhones? That if you could just use those, the way that you budget for these projects and the way that you kind of execute on them becomes totally different. So that is very much the mindset that we want to take.
Yeah, it's kind of like going back to first principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
A little bit.
And I think as you look at our sort of architecture here, right, kind of building on this point a little bit more, it kind of emphasizes those things, right? So even if you take a look at the power transmission system, which we're going to be using components that are available today for the laser power system. So we're going to be building off of components that are available either commercially or commercially available off the shelf. We're going to end up doing some customization, but these are laser systems that have been developed for things like metal cutting, and being able to repurpose them for this application, it allows us to actually put a version of this technology in orbit relatively soon.
How are you testing that? You said you're doing some lab testing. Are you doing a lot of simulation testing for something like this?
Yeah, so we're going to do a full spectrum of testing, from component testing to lab testing to environmental testing, and all this leading up to the space demonstration. So it'll be sort of maturing the technology. So for example, one of the things that we're going to be doing is testing the effect of atmosphere on our power transmission, and actually measuring how does our system behave in different weather conditions, right? We're going to be testing different kinds of photovoltaics for all the different components and say, how do these perform when you use different frequencies of light, for example? So a full spectrum of testing that we're going to be iterating on the ground, and kind of step by step.
And then what's your go-to-market strategy here? I mean, obviously, we're seeing with the advent of generative AI, we're seeing all these AI companies turning to nuclear, to solar power. I think Meta is recently saying they're turning to solar again. Stargate will use solar power to power the data centers. Like, do you think that AI companies will be like your number one customer?
We're going to start out at first with what we think are going to be applications that get power to places that it's a little bit hard to get it to. So AI applications, sort of providing large amounts of power to these very, very data intensive applications, is something we want to build to. The thing that we see our technology being able to solve problems for within the first couple of years of this technology is kind of coming back to the architecture, right? We'll have a constellation of satellites that are in orbit. And when you kind of think about building a constellation, the idea is that you have satellites that are passing overhead constantly. So you'll have one satellite that's able to provide power. It'll move out of the field of view. There'll be another satellite that provides power. But imagine being out in places like forward deployed military bases or remote mining applications where there's either very little infrastructure or that infrastructure is very hotly contested, right?
Mm-hmm.
We look at even the DoD market where we know that they spend about $14 billion a year annually on energy. And the bread and butter of that has been gasoline and diesel generators, right? So if you could instead say, hey, we've got a power receiver that you can take into the field. It's got a relatively small receiver aperture size, think 5 to 10 meters in diameter for the future state. And you would be able to bring something like this out into the battlefield or into a remote location and be able to connect to one of our satellites and be able to have it provide power around the clock. So imagine being able to provide power to a remote location in the middle of the night with a solar satellite.
So is it kind of like plugging directly into, whatever, a power grid somewhere or something? Or would you need kind of energy storage to go along with this? How exactly would that work? Because I think that's one of the limitations of solar a lot of the time is that it's not always being plugged directly into where it needs to go. And then you need to have some way to store it.
We imagine our ground stations are going to be little power grids on the move, or they're going to be little power grids that you could take out with you. So a receiver that's able to connect to satellites and get power. We contemplate having different versions of this. So you could imagine having some battery capacity on the receiver as well. If, for example, there's some sort of interruption to the power, you can actually store some power on the ground side. The idea is that it's going to be much smaller than you would need if you were just collecting solar power out in the field. And the way that that's kind of expressed is how much energy density is kind of transmitted to the receiver spot on the ground. So that's one of the things that we care a lot about is having this be more useful than just like lugging out solar panels in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask, it's such a large undertaking. I can understand a world where you go into space and collect solar for, space stations, satellites, space-based infrastructure. But to send it back, is there not enough, room on Earth to set up solar panels? What's the benefit of doing it from space? I mean, aside from the fact that you get kind of continuous access, or maybe that is the main benefit.
Yeah, the benefits are you get solar power in a much more tactical way. You get it on demand, not when the sun is shining, but when you have line of sight to a satellite. We think that actually the way that we're going to be transmitting power, when the sun sets for a solar panel, it doesn't do anything, right? So that one use case we immediately are able to kind of improve upon with a satellite in orbit, because you can actually have a satellite that's able to provide power still where it might be dark on the Earth, right? Similarly, ground solar stations, if there's heavy duty weather coverage, they're going to be negatively affected by that. Our power system, depending on the frequency of light that we use to transmit power, there's going to be some atmospheric effects from the clouds, but our beam of power is also relatively small. And so we're able to provide power potentially in between those interruptions from clouds and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
On top of that, if you think about the actual just power that's delivered on the ground, we think about applications like a solar rucksack. So basically a pack of solar panels that a troop would carry on their back into the battlefield. Right. Imagine if instead of having to rely on the sun for that power, that we could make a miniaturized version of our receivers where an individual troop could actually just lay out some panels and get a quick charge directly from orbit. That's the kind of dare I say it, space age sort of versions of this technology that I think are just really cool.
It sounds like sci-fi. It sounds like it'll be a long time to get there. What's next in innovation? That's not the right question. It's where. Puerto Rico, more than just a tropical paradise, it's innovation's paradise, where startups and global players coexist in a vast and vibrant ecosystem, where talent runs deep, highly skilled and bilingual. Plus, the island offers the most competitive tax incentives in the U.S. If you believe your business can go anywhere, Puerto Rico is the place. Find out more at investpr.org/equity. What do you think about funding. So you are bootstrapping this company, right, with your Robinhood winnings. Is that still correct? Have you got any investors lined up since we last connected?
So nothing to talk about directly on other investors. To start the company off, I bootstrapped it, which is correct. And the goal was to basically get the ball moving on this and to make it happen quickly. It's kind of the time frame of getting a first demonstration into orbit next year and having a first principled view on how this technology could become a reality. Now, just to be clear, like this, we're talking about building a constellation of thousands or tens of thousands or I don't know how many satellites in the future. We will definitely need more investors than me to make that happen. But my kind of goal with this was say, hey, this particular problem I think has been slept on and hasn't had a real sort of like serious attempt made at it from an industrial perspective. Because if you go back and look at everything that's been written about space solar power, it's terrifyingly expensive. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, right? Some of the prescriptions for space solar power originally called for building a single massive solar array space station in orbit, the size of a small city.
That doesn't sound smart. That sounds like a lot.
Yeah,
sounds like a lot of work.
Humans, we don't make stuff like that. I mean, we might someday, but like 2025 humans, like that's not something that's in our wheelhouse. Like we can't just magically put up a city in orbit.
Yeah, but a decentralized array, right? As which
Bingo.
is what you're talking about,
Bingo.
right? Just several, which, yeah, I guess maybe you needed like a today's mindset to kind of come up with that. We're consistently kind of decentralizing larger institutions, I think. But you don't have a lot of competitors in this space. There's Space Solar. I think they're doing something similar, but they're using high frequency radio waves instead of laser.
Yeah.
To get it back. I think there's Virtus Solis. They have also developed space-based solar power generation system in a similar way to collect solar energy, convert it to microwaves for transmission to ground stations. But yeah, you don't have a ton of competitors in the field. Like as you're a founder, so founders are always in investing mode, even when they're bootstrapped. How are you thinking about looking for investors for this? Like, are you looking at VC, which might be difficult because this is a high infrastructure, kind of a long-term play. Often VCs want to see a tighter turnaround. How are you thinking about this?
Yeah. First, on the topic of competition, there's something kind of interesting here where there's the community of people that are working on this, where I think we all want to see space solar power be a reality, right? So I think there's a positivity around like wanting to make this happen because
it's cool, because it's really cool.
In addition to the commercial efforts like us, there's also a bunch of academic work that's being done on it. For example, there's a group out of Caltech that's been working on this for a long time. So I just kind of say this to say, like, we want to do our part in making this happen. We think we've got an approach that's going to be really effective, breaking ground and maturing the technology. So we're kind of rooting for space solar power to happen. So the second part is like the sort of capital ecosystem for space. I think that there's like a cool opportunity here in that the ecosystem for space, I think it's going to be way more mature in a couple of years. And I think the thing that's going to be one of the biggest drivers is going to be access to orbit. I fundamentally believe that space, from a commercial standpoint, should be thought of as a platform, right? As a platform for distributing different kinds of goods and services. And the reason I kind of have that mindset is because that's kind of how I thought about Robinhood on mobile platforms, right? Mobile was a platform to distribute the financial services products that we were building. If you think about space and access to orbit in that same sort of way, you can kind of imagine how you can have like a commercial ecosystem that like builds around that platform.
So like Starship as a platform.
Bingo. Yeah. That still remains to be proven out. But like when I kind of look into the future, like that's an opportunity that I think that, I mean, you don't have to be super imaginative here, right? You can imagine how tons of companies can build on top of that, where stuff that was never really possible before, you're like, hey, there's a rideshare to space who wants to get on and try it out.
Well, that's it's a natural progression for commercialization of space and kind of just like really getting as much asset utilization out of that rocket as you can, right?
The big shift that's happening here, I mean, this has kind of been happening for a while. Space has been something that only nation states do. Like it's been a NASA thing, right? It's amazing to have a government that's supportive of this, but if you want to make it happen quickly, we got to use American capitalism. Like that's the special part about our society.
Yeah, I guess it's been a government thing for so long as well because of potential national security risks, right? If anyone with enough money can access the types of data that you can get from low orbit satellites, yeah, I can imagine that would be a problem.
And space, from its very genesis in human society, right? Like the Western version of space, you could make a pretty strong argument, like didn't kick off in earnest until Sputnik, and that was a national security thing. So I think space has always kind of had that component to it. But the thing is, if you bring American capitalism to the mix, just like stand aside, amazing shit's going to happen. Pardon my language. Like American capitalism is the thing that I think pushes innovation and progress and builds the world around us that we're so proud of. Like, let's do that in space. That's kind of the mindset I'm bringing to it.
Yeah. Well, speaking of national security risk, when they hire a lot of space companies that I've spoken to, when they hire people, they have to, at certain levels, you need to get kind of a security clearance because of maybe who you're contracting for or whatever. Is that something that you've had to think about yet, or you're just really in the tech phase of everything?
So we're still getting started. Nothing specific to talk about there just yet, but you can kind of imagine the ecosystem space is going to have a lot of sensitive applications. And again, I think for this point, I'll emphasize also commercial applications. Mm-hmm. One more point on this. I think I've said this a couple of times on a couple of other podcasts, but I think it's a big part of what I believe here is that if you could stand up another vertical of commerce in space, it's going to open up the doorways for a generation of aspiring entrepreneurs, people that want to work on space, like the next generation of people to say, hey, if I want to work in the space industry, there's actually commercial opportunities here outside of like defense, earth imaging, and telecommunications. If you get an energy industry in space, there's a few other industries that are like on the doorsteps of popping up in space too. You'll just have people from different walks of life saying, hey, maybe I'll get a degree in aerospace engineering and like want to do that with my life. Because we just saw that for the last 10 years with computer engineering. Why can't we do that with space engineering?
Yeah, definitely. Before we kind of start to close out, I wanted to ask you, this is a slight gear shift back to the funding landscape. Do you have any, like, there are going to be other founders out there listening to this who have maybe exited their companies and also have money and want to do something cool with it. Like, do you have any tips that you've learned that you've picked up so far about bootstrapping, and particularly with something as, pioneer tech as this?
Yeah, there's a lot of really good ideas out there that nobody's working on. There's also a lot of really terrible ideas out there that nobody's working on, but there's a big blank space of stuff that's not actively being competed on. That's kind of where my head is at, right? Like when I kind of see so much interest in AI, it's like, well, there's a lot of really smart people working on that. Let's make sure there's some smart people hopefully working on some of these other problems as well. I think with space, like my 2 cents are think outside of the box. Like this is in my opinion, at least, a relatively sort of like nascent ecosystem. So we don't have to just do telecommunications in space. Like we can do other things, and there's other novel applications that are out there. That'd be kind of my 2 cents.
Yeah.
Also, the realm of what's possible. I'll add one more thing. Having a first principled view on like what the actual driving cost of things are.
Yeah. A lot of research, I think, would have to go into that, which should go into any company that you start.
Mm-hmm.
Now, last time we spoke, you mentioned that one of the first, demos or something that you're planning to do for this would have to do with Burning Man. Can you share anything about that?
Yes. There may be a first demonstration of the technology that happens in the desert, and there may or may not be a really cool light installation involved. But
I'm imagining when you take a magnifying glass and start like burning something with the sun. I'm imagining that, but with a satellite, and that's how the burning structure erupts into flames.
I'm imagining more like an art car situation, not a Burning Man structure. I'm thinking more Burning Man like the festival, but not actually that.
Wait, do they not burn a giant effigy?
There is a big giant effigy at the festival, but the thing I want to do is light up some light installations in the desert.
That sounds safer. That's probably better.
Yeah.
Okay, well, Baiju, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can our listeners find you?
I think the place to find me is probably on X, formerly Twitter. So my handle is BeijuBot, just like my name, and check out Aetherflux as well.
Great. And I'm on Blue Sky. I'm on X, and you can always find Equity at EquityPod. Thank you, our listeners. We will talk to you next time. Equity is produced by Teresa Loconsolo with editing by Kel. We'd also like to thank TechCrunch's audience development team. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.